So we're going to continue this series we've been in on the book of Jonah, and I'm excited to get into it today. I think this message that I'm going to share today is quite relevant to a lot of what we're facing in our own lives and communities today, and so we're going to get into it. When I was a teenager and in college, I loved this pastor and author and speaker named Rob Bell. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? I used to listen to Rob Bell sermons all the time when I was young. And I think he's great. But he wrote a book about the Bible, and he asked this question in his book. He says, what's the best question to ask when you're reading the Bible? What's the best question to ask when you're reading the Bible? And he's thinking when you're reading a particular book of the Bible or text from the Bible, what's the best question to start with? Maybe you can take a moment to think about that. What is the best question to ask when you're reading the Bible and trying to understand what this message is all about? And his advice is to start with this question. Why did people find this important to write down? Why did people find it important to write this particular text down? You know, most stories in the ancient world were not written down, and they were passed down through the oral tradition. They told stories aloud. You know, they would get around with their families and friends, and they would tell these ancient stories, these stories that really define who they are as a people and as a community. They didn't have a printing press like we do. Writing things down took great time, it took great effort, and it actually was very expensive to write things down. Many people were illiterate and didn't know how to read, and so something written on paper wouldn't serve them all that well anyway. However, there were some stories that made it into the ancient manuscripts and were written down. And so it ought to beg the question, why did the authors of the books that we have in the Bible decide to write them down and put them into their official and sacred writings? There were many, many other stories that didn't get put in. There were many other things that happened that didn't get written about. And so why these particular stories? What was it about these stories? What was going on around them at the time where they wrote these down that made them want to put these stories in our Bible? You know, a few years ago, I learned something that really influenced the way I understand the Old Testament in particular. And it's this, we talked about this in our Jonah class, actually. Much of the Old Testament was written down during or directly after the Babylonian exile. So much of the Old Testament was written down in written form during or after the exile. Now, they likely had different documents that had been created in the past, maybe fragments of stories. They had their oral traditions. These stories were sacred to them, and they would cherish them and hold on to them for hundreds of years before they actually decided to write all these stories down and put them in their official Hebrew Bible. Let me give you a really simplified history of the Israelites so you understand what I'm talking about. So we know about the creation, happened in Genesis, Genesis 1 and 2, God created the heavens and the earth, all that. Then we have the fall. We have all these different individuals that come through. We eventually get to Noah and the flood where the world had gotten in such a violent and destructive place that the story goes that God sent a flood and spared Noah and all these animals on the ark. Then after that, we get to this time of these patriarchs, these male kind of heads of families in the book of Genesis, starting with Abraham. Abraham was chosen by God to be the father of a great nation, and there was this promise that through you, all the nations of the world will be blessed. We have Abraham, then Isaac, and then Jacob. Eventually, the Israelites make their way to Egypt, and kind of the story of Joseph. Joseph kind of gets there first, and then ends up, there's a famine, and all these things happen, and so the Israelites make their way finally to Egypt, because that is where they could find food, because Egypt had done a good job of storing up food, and so they were able to survive. But as we know the story, eventually Pharaoh grew tired of the Israelites and began to enslave the Egyptians, or the Israelites as the story goes. Then we read about the Exodus when Moses is called by God to set his people free, and we get the plagues and all that. They end up crossing the Red Sea. And they were promised this promised land, but they didn't get there very quickly. It took 40 years for them to get into the promised land, and they lived in the wilderness for quite some time. Finally, they move into the promised land, and they begin to kind of form their community, and they ended up not having kings right away because they believed that God was king, and they were specifically told you are not to have a king. If you do have a king, things will be bad for you, they were told actually, because kings are going to take from you, and they're not going to give much to you, and they're going to end up hurting you and oppressing you. And so they ended up electing judges, was kind of appointing judges to lead them there for a period of time. The judges were not very good leaders. Most of the judges were pretty terrible leaders in the story of the Israelites. And then finally, the people kept asking God for a king because they looked around at all the surrounding nations, and they're like, they got kings, we want kings too. And so God finally relents and lets them have a king. And they had their unified kingdom there for a while under the leadership first of King Saul, and then we have King David, and then we have King Solomon. And then shortly, through all those three kings, they were unified, but then it didn't take long for them to start kind of feuding with one another, and the kingdom ended up splitting into two, and they had a divided kingdom. The northern kingdom kept the name Israel, and the southern kingdom was called Judah. And so there was a lot of kings in both the north and the south. When you're reading through some of the books of the Old Testament, you might get confused because there's actually two different kingdoms that are being described throughout some of those historical books. And so eventually, both the north and the south end up falling to foreign empires because you had the Assyrians, you had the Babylonians, the Persians, you had all these big empires that were starting to form around them, and the kingdoms ended up falling to these foreign empires. And so we get to the time of exile. And so we're talking about a time specifically when the Babylonian Empire came and finally kind of wiped them all out, very brutal empire, and ended up kind of deporting a lot of folks. Some folks ended up staying, but life got really, really hard for them during the exile. And now most of the history and a lot of the Old Testament books were written down during this time of exile and crisis for their nation. They experienced this kind of traumatic, earth-shattering tragedy, and they decided that they needed to revisit their history, their calling, their values, and they wanted to kind of put it together on paper so they would not forget it. I imagine they did a lot of soul searching, asking hard questions, deciding they needed to retell their story, to lay it all out, perhaps to help them get back on track and kind of stay focused for many more generations to come. After the exile, the Israelites faced many choices. Because there was actually a moment when the Babylonians fell to the Persians and they were allowed to go back to their land. And now they didn't have full kind of autonomy over their day-to-day lives and governing themselves, but they were allowed to go back home. And so when they were allowed to go back home, they had a lot of important kind of questions to think about. Like, how are we going to live together in this new reality? I want y'all to think about it. For quite a long time, the Israelites had been exiled, so they were living in different parts throughout the world. They had this mixed group of people who were once scattered coming back together in their homeland. They had learned different cultural practices from the different places where they lived. Many of these folks would have married people of other ethnic groups and nationalities. They would have been mixed families that would have come back to the Holy Land. Some people would have remained there in Palestine, but others were forced to leave. And so you would have had kind of the remainers in the land, but then you would have had returners who were coming back. And so you had this mixed multitude, this great diversity of people who were coming back and trying to figure out how they're going to form life together. And they had a lot of hard questions to ask. Like, how are we going to live together? Are we going to be kind of open and inclusive, or are we going to be closed and exclusive? Are we going to be open to a new thing that God might be doing among us? Or are we going to cling to kind of past rigidity and isolationism? I imagine in this kind of mixed multitude of people, there were certainly those who felt like they needed to kind of cleanse Israel, of foreigners. There was even movements to want to outlaw intermarriage with other ethnic groups, force upon people oppressive laws and regulations. However, there were others, like the prophet Isaiah, for example, in the Old Testament, who were really trying to call people to see a bigger vision of what God might be doing at this moment in their history. There's this really cool moment, and there's a lot of cool prophecy in Isaiah, but there's these moments when Isaiah is kind of looking around and kind of almost envisioning that all these different people coming back to Israel, like, this is what God was talking about a long time ago. You remember back in Genesis when God told Abraham, you're going to be a blessing so that God can bless all the nations of the world through you? The prophet Isaiah was really envisioning that maybe this return home from exile, all these mixed multitude of people, this is what God was prophesying and talking about so long ago. That this is God's vision of opening up God's blessing and promise to the whole world. And so in many ways, Isaiah and others were trying to help their people see that outsiders are not a threat, actually, but these are people we need to embrace because this was part of God's dream all along. And it probably shouldn't be hard for you to see even connections in the way Jamar Tisby talks about how history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it does rhyme. and we hear echoes and kind of rhyming of history. And think about this ancient history where you have this group of people, this mixed multitude, trying to figure out how they're going to live together. And they're trying to discern, are we going to, in a sense, kind of make Israel great again, and we're going to build up ourselves and try to shut out people who are different than us and cleanse our nation of these folks that we feel like are threats to us? Or are we going to open ourselves up more and invite folks in and celebrate the diversity that we see among us? And we see these kinds of debates going on now, and they've been really hard to work through now, and we're seeing a lot of violence even right now around these kinds of conversations. But this is the story, in many ways, that the Israelites were facing after exile. And so, like many other stories in the Old Testament, the story of Jonah is believed that it came after the exile, and it could have been pretty short after the exile, close to the exile, or even just a few hundred years after the exile. But sometime in this post-exile period, we believe the story of Jonah was written down and told at that point and put into their official canon. This story itself, though, in Jonah took place before the exile. However, the writers kind of went back to their old stories and decided, hey, this story we've been telling about this guy named Jonah and the Assyrians and the Ninevites, like, this story actually could speak to our current moment. And so we need to write this story down, and we need to tell it to as many people as possible because this is a powerful story. And I believe this story in particular can speak to us today. We talk about this African idea of Sankofa, where you go back to the past and take those things from the past that are worthwhile and can help us into our future. And this is what this story is. It's something we need to bring from our past to help us move into the future. So the question that we're going to wrestle with today, just for a few minutes, is why did the author of Jonah decide to put this old story in writing in this moment of exile, when they're trying to figure out how they're going to relate to the nations, how they're going to relate to all these diversity of people that are among them. And so I'm going to read the story of Jonah for you. I'm going to read all of chapter 1, actually, because it's not that long, and it'll help you get a sense of kind of what's going on in this story. So we'll begin chapter 1, verse 1. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness had come up before me. The Ninevites were part of the Assyrian Empire, and they were not very well liked by the Israelites. And so, it begins. Go preach against these folks. Violent, brutal empire. But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed to Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. Then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. All of the sailors were afraid, and each cried out to their own God. and they threw the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. But Jonah had gone below deck, where he lay down and fell into a deep sleep. The captain went to him and said, "How can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe he will take notice of us, so that we will not perish." Then the sailors said to each other, "Come, let us cast lots to find out who is responsible for this calamity." They cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. So they asked him, "Tell us, who is responsible for making all this trouble for us? What kind of work do you do? Where do you come from? What is your country? From what people are you?" He answered, "I am a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." This terrified them, and they asked, "What have you done?" They knew he was running away from the Lord, because he had already told them so. The sea was getting rougher and rougher, and so they asked him, "What should we do to make the sea calm down for us?" "Pick me up and throw me into the sea," he replied, "and it will become calm. I know that it is my fault that this great storm has come upon you." Instead, the men did their best to row back to land, but they could not, for the sea grew even wilder than before. Then they cried out to the Lord, "Please, Lord, do not let us die for taking this man's life. Do not hold us accountable for killing an innocent man, for you, Lord, have done as you pleased." Then they took Jonah and threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. At this, the men greatly feared the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to him. So Jonah was called by God to go prophesy to the enemy nation, the Assyrians in Nineveh. Now, I wonder, as the readers of this story heard this, they probably made some assumptions about what they were going to hear in the next verses about this man Jonah. They may think, man, this story is about God's favor on us and God's hatred for our enemies. The Assyrians were awful. They're probably like, "Yes, Jonah, go and preach against the Assyrians." However, like I said last week, the story of Jonah is going to blow our assumptions out of the water. Instead of going to Nineveh as God instructed, Jonah went the opposite direction toward the faraway city of Tarshish. He did not like the Assyrians, and he did not want to give them a chance to repent and turn to God. I imagine many of the Israelites are still on track with this story. Yes, makes sense. The Assyrians were terrible. Good for you, Jonah. You should not give them a chance to turn back to God. But then things got weird, okay? He boarded a boat full of foreign pagans, all right? He went to the bottom of the boat, and he fell into a deep sleep, and a huge storm arose, and the entire ship was at risk of being destroyed. The author Tim Keller wrote a book about Jonah, and he lays out some pretty interesting contrasts that you see in this first chapter. And I'm going to just break them down for you, because it'll show you that this is kind of turning everything upside down. So Jonah, the Jewish prophet, is completely out of touch with this dangerous situation. He's a prophet. He's supposed to be in touch with what's going on. He's out of touch. However, the pagan sailors are alert, and they see what's happening. Jonah, the Jewish prophet, is absorbed in his own problems. Yet the pagan sailors are trying to seek the common good of everybody on this ship. Jonah, the Jewish prophet, does not pray to his God. Yet the pagan sailors are praying mightily to their gods. Jonah, the Jewish prophet, is completely oblivious to the fact that God is sending this storm. The pagan sailors are spiritually aware enough to see that this is not just some random storm. Jonah, the Jewish prophet, is small-minded and bigoted. The pagan sailors want to save Jonah's life and are even open to calling on Jonah's God. The Jewish prophet in this first chapter is doing all the wrong things, and the pagan sailors are doing all the right things in this story. Now, if the reader thought this story was about God's favor on Israel and God's judgment of their enemies, they might be a bit disappointed as they get through chapter 1. And get this, at the very end of the story, it's the pagan sailors who make sacrifices to the God of Israel and vow their allegiance to him. It turns it all upside down. So back to the original question, why did the author of Jonah decide to put this old story into writing? Well, remember, after the exile, the Israelites are trying to figure out how to live in this new reality. They no longer have a sovereign nation. They have to deal with the nations every day of their lives. Many of their people had intermarried with other foreigners from enemy nations. Perhaps the author of Jonah was kind of in the same line of thinking as Isaiah and others, thinking that it's time actually that we open up to the nations. And so Jonah goes back to their history, the writer of Jonah goes back to their history, finds this old story about this prophet Jonah, and he wants to tell this story. And so he tells a story about pagans, people from the surrounding nations doing good and godly things, caring for an Israelite, and even worshiping the God of Israel. I want to give you a recent example of I think how these kinds of stories can help us. In 2003, I was in college, and this really kind of bad moment for our nation and for much of the world happened. In 2003, our government declared war on Iraq. I don't know if y'all remember this. At that time in our history, Muslims during that time were being vilified and harassed and demonized. Post 9/11, there was a lot of targeted enforcement of Muslim people and Arabs in our nation. It was a really low moment in our history. And then in 2003, we declare war on Iraq. It turns out there were a lot of lies that were told that got us into that war. It was a very dark moment in our history. We were told at that moment that the people of Iraq were our enemies and that we needed to do this or we were all going to be in trouble. Now, during that time, this guy named Shane Claiborne, I don't know if y'all have heard of him. I've had the opportunity to meet him a couple of times. Really awesome guy, but he's a Christian activist and author and speaker. He lives in Philadelphia in this kind of communal setting there in this place called the Simple Way in Philadelphia. But during the war on Iraq, he actually traveled there with an Iraq peace team. And he was there during this massive shock and awe campaign. I don't know if you all remember this. I remember watching it on the news where we just dropped so many bombs on their cities during this campaign. And he was there during this shock and awe campaign with this peace team. After he came back from Iraq, he went around and he told stories of his time in this so-called enemy nation. He told stories about Iraqis providing hospitality to him, providing kindness to him and his friends, care for him and his team, even when their lives were in danger. On one occasion, he tells this kind of harrowing story when they were in a vehicle and their tire blew out on their truck. And they ended up getting injured from the car accident. And then they actually started taking fire because there was a battle happening nearby. And they were in a life-threatening situation. They came under attack, and local Iraqis actually came and rescued them and saved their lives by showing them radical kindness and hospitality in that moment. They took them into their homes, they took them to the hospital, they fed them, and they took care of them in this moment. They showed love to Shane, an American, a citizen of the very nation that was bombing them at that exact moment. I mean, what a powerful story. And his testimonies that he would share about Iraq, they deeply impacted me. This was when I discovered him and his work. It helped many Christians see that they actually aren't all that different from Muslims across the world, and that we actually share a common humanity. The supposed enemy in the story actually was doing good and godly things, caring for these folks in their time of need. And at that point in my life, I remember post 9/11, I was terrified. Like, I thought we were in trouble, and I thought we needed to rise up and have a big military to defend ourselves against all the terrorists in the world. Like, I literally was convinced of this because this is what they were telling us, right? And so much of it was spin and manipulation and lies. And these stories helped me at a moment in my life when I was trying to figure out which direction I was going. And I was being influenced by some things, talk radio and different things that were telling me a whole different story than what Shane was talking about. And in this moment in my life, it was really important for me to hear these stories because they helped me see God's vision for everyone in the world to be treated with love and dignity and respect. And his stories really, for me, blurred the lines between who is an enemy and who is a friend. And he helped me to see that often those lines that we create, it's just all manufactured, like it's all made up. And often the quote-unquote enemies that we're told about, in fact, aren't our enemies at all. And most of the people in Iraq, they were not our enemies. These were people who practice hospitality and kindness and love, even to Americans from the enemy nation. And as I was thinking about this story of Jonah, particularly in chapter 1, as Jonah is receiving this kindness, I mean, these people on this ship wanted to save Jonah's life and did all they could to care for him, even as he was the very reason that their lives were in danger. Even he who was saying, I'm a Hebrew, all this stuff. Jonah had a lot in his mind where he did not necessarily like people from other places, and he was not open to them. He was down at the bottom of the ship, not helping with anything, fast asleep during this storm. Yet these people still tried to love him. They still tried to care for him. They tried to make this work. And I think the story of Jonah in many ways is blurring the lines between who are enemies, who are friends, and helping us to have more of an openness to those who are different than us. And so I believe the story of Jonah was told for a reason. And I think the story of Jonah was trying to speak to the Israelites as they were coming back from exile, trying to help them see that, hey, these definitions where we put some people over here and some over here, I think Jonah's trying to throw all that and mix it all up, turn it all upside down, say, hey, the vision forward is actually not to put up your shields and protect yourself from all the people different than you, but it's actually to open your arms and be willing to embrace those and give God a chance to work in their lives and show them the love and kindness that God is wanting us to show. And so I think this story obviously has a lot to say to us now. In this moment in our own history of our own nation, and this is not just here, this is all across the world. People are asking these very questions. In this globalized society that we're all living in, who are we going to be? Who are we going to be? Are we going to close, tighten up our borders? Are we going to shut people out and circle our wagons? Or are we going to open our arms and try to be open to others and trust that we actually can grow and change and we can become better when we invite more people to the table? And so I'm excited to continue to go through this series with you all and continue to kind of pull out some of these really rich kind of messages I think that Jonah has for us. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.